We're going to learn about a new kind of loop today, but first we're going to review by looking at a good old while loop. So here we have a while loop. We have this variable num that starts at 20, and we're going to loop while num is greater than 10, and we'll subtract 1 from num every time through the loop. So basically, our loop doesn't do too much. It just prints out the value of num on every iteration, and then it adds 1 to a counter. So this counter starts at 0, and basically counter will tell us how many iterations of this loop that we've done. So if I build and run, we'll see that I start at 20, right? I count down to 11. I stop when num is equal to 10, right? And then I print that I did 10 iterations of our loop. So I counted the number of iterations and then printed out the number of iterations that I did. Okay, so yeah, so this works great. And because the condition on my while loop gets checked at the beginning of each iteration, if I start with, say, num equals 5, right? And I build and run now, we'll see that I do 0 iterations of this loop. The condition on my loop is never true, so I never do any iterations of the body of the loop. Now we're going to look at a new kind of loop. Here what we have is called a do-while loop. So notice this loop does exactly the same thing as my other loop. I have a variable num that starts at 20. I'm going to loop while num is greater than 10. And I do exactly the same thing in the body of my loop that I did in my previous program. I print the value of num, subtract 1 from num, and add 1 to counter. And then when I'm all done, I print the number of iterations I did of my loop. So if I build this and run this, it looks just like that first run of my while loop, right? I loop for 10 iterations. But now let's look at what happens when I change this to 5. Okay. So just like in the previous example, since I have the same condition on the loop, the condition on the loop will never be true. However, this is a do-while loop, not a while loop. And so I'm actually going to do 1 iteration of my loop. So why is that? Well, that's because in a do-while loop, the condition gets checked at the end of the iteration. So when I'm executing my code, I get to the do, I come inside and I do 1 complete iteration of the loop before I check the condition for the first time. So in a do-while loop, I will always execute the body of the loop at least 1 time. There's no way to completely skip over the loop like there is in a while loop. After I do 1 iteration, I check the condition, I realize it's false, and then I don't do any additional iterations. I just continue on with my program. If the condition had been true, like in the example where num started at 20, I would just go and continue to do iterations of my loop, checking up the end to see if my condition was still true. So do-while loop, again, it's a lot like a while loop, except I just have a do at the beginning of my loop, and the condition goes immediately after, no spaces or anything, the closing curly brace for the loop body. While, I have the keyword while, and then the condition, and then a semicolon. So this is the only loop where you put a semicolon after the condition in the do-while loop. So this is really great in situations where you know that you want to do some sort of action at least once and then check the value before you decide if you want to loop. So for example, if you have a situation where you have some sort of action and you want to do it once and then ask the user if they want to continue, right? One of the problems where you ask the user to enter like Y or N if they wanted to continue. A do-while loop works really well there because you almost always want to do that action at least once and then give the user the option of whether or not they want to continue. And it turns out that there are a fair number of situations where we have a body of a loop that we want to execute once, and then we want to ask the user if they want to continue. You can always do the exact same thing with a while loop by just taking the body of the loop and duplicating it once before you get to the while statement. But a do-while loop is a kind of convenient loop to use when you have a set of expressions and you know you want to do them once, but then you want to have future iterations dependent on whether or not a condition is true.